Hi, I'm Heather Hubbard. I went from being a lawyer and partner at one of the largest firms in America to becoming an online personality and successful entrepreneur. I know what it takes to rise to the top. I also know all too well the toll it can take on your health and personal life. So, how do you shine bright without burning out? How do you chase joy while achieving success? You're listening to the Hustle and Flow podcast. Welcome back to Hustle and Flow. I'm your host, Heather Hubbard, and we are on episode 189. And today we're talking about the secrets to happiness. And these aren't just like theoretical secrets. We're talking about science-backed secrets to happiness. And we have a wonderful special guest that I met at Miraval in February. So today we have Bijal Choksi, and she is a Wharton and Columbia University-educated social and organizational psychologist and leadership coach who specializes in helping people be happier at work, which we all need. She mainly does this through helping people develop a professional and leadership style that is effective, but equally important that it is authentic and touching on one's values, their cultural background, and their personality. And she is kind of like Wendy from the TV series Billions, but much more ethical. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thanks, Heather. Great to be here with you. And it was just serendipitous that we happened to be joined together for a group dinner at Miraval that day.
Okay, so can we talk about that? Actually, though, before we get to that, because I'll totally forget. So I saw the reference to Billions and I had to look it up. And apparently it's been out forever. So tell me, for those of us who maybe, aren't familiar with Billions, what is this TV show and should we be watching it?
Oh, it's kind of like a modern day Dynasty or Dallas for those of us that grew up in the 80s and 90s. So there's a little bit of that drama, family drama in there. Not to the extent where a character wakes up and the entire season was a dream. For those of you
Yeah.
that watched that season of Dallas, that was a kind of odd. Not quite to that extent, but it's a modern day family making money and deception. But the progressive thing that the main character has done is for his investment company, they have an organizational psychologist on staff to help employees in the moment of stress. I mean, I think that's pretty spectacular.
And
So
this is the Wendy, but she's doing some unethical things.
yeah, but at times yeah, she kind of is on the border there. So I work further from that border where I'm fully in my integrity.
All right. Well, now I totally have to binge watch that entire show because that's right up my alley, but I had never heard of it before. So I'm glad I saw, yeah, that reference. All right, let's talk about Miraval. Those who listen know that I lead retreats there. I love Miraval. I've been doing it since 2016. How did you first start working with Miraval? Because you come in as a guest expert at their different properties.
I do occasionally. And so it's how that relationship started was that as I was there as a guest, I noticed over the years that the clientele was changing. There was more diversity, there was more conversation happening that had to do with women's careers, as opposed to earlier on, it was and there's no right or wrong about any of this, but more conversations were about life related things. And so I had approached Miraval and it just wanted to make sure that they knew that the conversations that were happening among guests there were shifting, and yet they were not doing anything to bring in anything related to people's careers on site,
Mhm.
anything that would help them once they got back home. And where are we spending so much of our time? At work. So that was related to the initial conversation that I had at Miraval. And then that we were brainstorming different ways that we could have some offerings there that could apply for people whether they were working or not. So I would say I'm probably one of the first speakers that they have had that talks about specifically what are things that we can do to make us happier at work, not just broadly in life. Yeah.
I love this story. I didn't know this. I mean, I just think it just goes to show that when you notice that there is a need and you take initiative, that right, we can collaborate and pitch and things can come to fruition. Sometimes we wait, or we're like, that's not been done before. So I love this story that you saw the need and then you were like, let's do this.
Mm, thank you.
All right. So how long have you what so you said that you were attending Miraval before you actually started teaching there. What is it about Miraval that had you going there?
Yeah, I was introduced by a friend who knew that I needed some assistance. I needed a place to get away to. I mean, shit happens in life. Is it okay that I'm
Yeah.
saying
Yeah,
four-letter word?
I cuss all the time.
Okay,
Thanks for asking.
perfect. Then we're a good fit here. Yes.
Yeah.
So, shit happens in life. And part of being happy is having the expectation that life is not going to be a cocktail party. So I think that being realistic is a benefit. However, sometimes we just get rocked, like right off of our chair.
Yeah.
And so I had my younger son had a really bad concussion, ended up having a TBI, traumatic brain injury, which completely changed his behavior. We did a lot of tests and years of different approaches, biochemical, other type of therapies, and things weren't really shifting. So I was at my wits' end. I don't know if your listeners can understand, but sometimes you feel guilty because well, I should say from an I perspective, I felt guilty because I just wanted to run away from my life.
Yeah.
And it's not that I didn't love my children, my husband, my life in general, but it was really hard. And for someone like me who is first generation in the US, firstborn, and I was like a second mom to my younger brother, I just developed a more controlling kind of life. I like structure. I wanted to be able to control what was happening in my life. And yet here was this individual that I loved, and I felt like I could do nothing to help him enough. And so my friend Kathy, who had been going to Miraval, said, I just want you to come with me for a weekend. Instead of running away from your entire life, come with me for a long weekend to Miraval, and then let's reassess how you're feeling. And that was how I started with them.
Yeah. I love that you're sharing that. And I do think, I mean, it's so important to just have a place where you can go to and get grounded and recentered, but also knowing that sometimes, because you're a professional, right? I mean, you're like, why can I not figure this out? Like, I just want to like apply the science, apply the logic, apply my intellect. And sometimes we can't do that. And then we feel like giving up when it's like, no, we just need to return home to ourselves and our bodies and have a moment.
That would have been really nice if somebody had told that to me in the
Yeah.
moment and showed me how to do that. So instead, I went to Miraval, and it was more baby steps to end up with, with what you're sharing now. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So how did you let's talk about your background and the happiness piece, the science part. How did you get into the science of happiness?
Sometimes we learn what we need the most of. And so it was because of my son that I already mentioned. It was
Mm,
at some point, years into it, I realized that crap, I really cannot control this. Yes, I can go to Miraval, even if I can go a few times a year, I still can't control the situation back at home. I can
right.
control things about my career. Work was easy. It's like,
Mm,
wow, I can pretty much control that. But at home, I couldn't. And so at some point, having that light bulb go off that I can either change my circumstances around me, or I've got to change myself. And I couldn't, I really, as I mentioned, I thought about changing the circumstances around my life, running away, starting something
right.
else. But I ended up not choosing that path. So the only other one left for me was changing something about myself. And so that was when, just serendipitously again, I found out about this program through UC Berkeley around the science of happiness. And I am a data girl. So don't give me fluff, don't tell me this should work. Don't give me research of N is one person in it. And so there was something about that science of happiness that really compelled and drew me in. And then when I looked into the two professors that were teaching it, I realized that through this certification program, these two individuals, they were real. They're not, those people who you meet that kind of exemplify toxic positivity. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, just focus on the positive, just be grateful for what you have. Like that never worked for me. And so one of the professors, he's clinically depressed and he's
Mm.
teaching a science of happiness course. And I loved that. He's saying that I've done the research. And if some of these techniques work on me, they're going to work for the general population. So that was a year-long program that I went through to get certified in the science of happiness. And that was about, gosh, that was two homes before. So I guess that was probably about a decade ago.
Yeah. Well, when we were having dinner, which again was so random, we just both, so at Miraval, they have what's called a community table, and you can sign up and meet other people. And often, so I do both. Sometimes I'll just have, like, if I'm there before or after a retreat, I'll just have dinner by myself. But sometimes it's nice to just meet people. You meet the most interesting people with the most interesting stories there. And we just ended up at the same table and we're sitting beside each other and chatting. But you shared with me the percentages. And I'm sure there's a ton of this, so I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. But the percentages of like what makes up happiness, and it was so interesting to me and eye opening. And in some ways, it was a little disappointing, and then in other ways, it was really encouraging. So I was just curious if you were willing to share that information with the audience.
Of course. And yes, it's bittersweet, isn't it? So
Yeah.
I think the data that you're talking about has to do with our happiness set point. And this is where, if you notice that you have friends, family in your life who they have a certain disposition. So in the science world, in the psychology world, we call that the set point. And this has to do with your genetics and how they express themselves. And so the percentage that your genes contribute to your happiness set point is 40%. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. It's 50%.
Yeah.
It's 50%. Yeah, it's 50%. So that, that's like I said, it's bittersweet because it's 50% that we maybe don't have control over. However, in today's world, we know about the field called epigenetics, which says that we're not a slave to the genes that we were born to. Even if we're predisposed to heart conditions or macular degeneration, like I am, it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean it's inevitable. And it's the same even for the happiness set point. So there's a little bit of optimism even around that 50%. But the other optimistic thing when I look at that number is that what's the other 50%? So, okay, so maybe half I can't directly control, but what's the half that I can control? So that's the part that I think we can be optimistic about.
And what is the other 50%?
um, well, is it okay if I ask you a question?
You may, yeah.
What would you think most people would say as far as what contributes to someone's happiness outside of the genetic set point?
I think their circumstances, their situation, what's going on around them at any given time.
Yep, that's right. That's the number one reason that people say when I ask this question at workshops. And turns out that that is not the number one thing outside of genes. It turns out that that only contributes to about 10% of one's feeling of happiness. Only 10%, like a teeny sliver of the pie, is based on one circumstance. And
Mhm.
they have shown this through various studies. One study where people who had won large amounts of money in a lottery and they had taken their assess how happy they were when they won it and then looked at what happened later on, and it turns out it took less than a year for their happiness levels to go below what they were before they got the money. So it is interesting that the
Yeah.
circumstances really don't account for that much. So yeah.
And I think so many of us, we do strive for. like we have these markers, right? It's like, well, when I have this, I'll feel successful. I'll feel happy when this is resolved. And we keep moving towards that. And we've all, I think, had those situations where we want something and then it happens. And there is that moment of euphoria and excitement. And then it's like, oh, wait, that didn't really change anything.
It's so true. It's like if you're going to buy a car and you're super excited about it, that's fantastic. In the moment, there's that hedonistic happiness, that feeling of temporary joy, and that's great. And then how long does that last? A month maybe before you're thinking about the next car or the add-on or you're eyeing something else. So yeah, it's in last year I was studying Buddhism, and I'm not really religious, so I was more curious about it. But in Buddhism, there's this concept called hungry ghost. And this has to do with a ghost cannot actually eat. They're hollow, right? They're not really physically there. And so in Buddhism, there's this concept of a hungry ghost going around and wanting to consume more and more and more because nothing really satisfies the
Mm,
deeper need that the ghost has, which isn't really food. There's something else there.
yeah.
And I think that concept really applies just for us as humans with our physical bodies and our
Mhm.
actual minds on this earth, which is that thinking I'll be happy when. Let me just have one more. Once I get that promotion, once I make more money, once I get married, then I'll be happy. And all that happens is that we're kicking the can down the road if
Mhm.
that's what we are pinning our happiness on.
Yeah. All right. So if we have 50% genetics, 10% circumstances, what's the other 40%?
This is great. You can tell the lawyer background, attention to details, did not let me get away with not sharing the other percentages. So the 40%, so of what's left, so 40% can be categorized as lifestyle choices. These are those intentional actions that we can take, but that we need to take proactively. They can't just happen to us through osmosis. That
Mhm.
would fall under the circumstances category. So
Yeah.
these are things that we're choosing to do that can boost our happiness significantly. So
Mm.
that accounts for 40% of our happiness levels. Yay! 40% we can control.
I know. I remember when you were telling me that at first, I was just like, oh, wow. So there's like 60% I have no control over, right? Like when you think of your well, I mean, you can change circumstances, but sometimes you can't. Um, when you've got those combined, it's just like, well, that's depressing. But then I was like, well, wait, 40% is a pretty, like, that's pretty high. If someone told me I had a 40% chance of winning the lottery, I would buy a ticket. If someone told me I had a 40% chance of a tornado hitting my house, I'm right. I'm going to take precautions. So that's a meaningful number and definitely moves the needle, right? I mean, the fact that, I mean, that's a lot. I mean, I wanted it to be 90%, but
Yeah.
it also releases a little bit of the burden of like, I can't, it's not all,
Well,
up to me.
it's not all up to you. And also, it's unrealistic to think that we'll be happy at all times.
Hmm.
It's that those expectations, that mindset is really important, even in happiness, because it helps us not be so melodramatic and so tied to those negative emotions when life circumstances just throw us off. It's
Yeah.
like surfing, in the ocean. My brother took up surfing during the pandemic, and it's like you don't know which way the wave is necessarily going to take you. You have to do the little dance with
Mm.
your surfboard in the water, and it's the same with life where it is going to throw us off. I
Yeah.
lost my dad 4 years ago, and that just shook my foundation. And of course, it made me less happy for a
Yeah.
little while. But having the foundations of knowing what it takes to keep being happy
Mm.
at a deeper level, I think that's important. So, yeah, I might have just gone off from the question that you asked.
No,
Let me
no, no,
know.
not at all. Well, I'm curious about this set point. And how that relates when like because bad things will come our way, right? Like we cannot avoid that. Things are going to happen and the longer we live, the more we're going to experience. But when I was on my health sabbatical and, we chatted a little bit about this at Miraval when I had a tumor and I literally my brain wasn't working the same way. And one of the most helpful things that someone shared with me was a therapist was that it would be helpful if I considered where my set point was. So it used to be up here. And how do we recalibrate to right now? It's right here. And it was so helpful when they shared that with me because it allowed me to stop trying to get up here when my body literally wouldn't let me get up there. And then it was like, this is just what we're dealing with. So I'm curious, and I don't know if that's too big of a question, but how does knowing your set point work, and can your set point change? I'm assuming like if you've got circumstances and stuff, and how can you use that to actually ground you and serve as an anchor?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. So if I'm working with clients on this, I have them do their assessment on a 10-point scale. So
Okay.
there is some questions that I ask around this. And so based on where they are at, let's say somebody is at a 5 at this point in time. I think what you were saying and why that therapist was so helpful to you is that it grounds you and it lets you assess, okay, 3 months from now, where am I now? And
Yeah.
what's the difference? And what did I do that perhaps was in my control that I can do again? So statistically speaking, if there is a 2 point difference on this scale of 1 to 10, that's really significant.
Mm.
So if you know if you're at a 5 and you try, and maybe we'll get into some of the practices people can do to shift their happiness levels, but if you go from a 5 to a 7, that's actually really significant. And it's not significant just like on a statistical basis, a percentage difference. I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about how it feels to you in the moment. When you wake up, when you go through your day, how do you feel? 2 points makes a really big difference in how somebody experiences joy and that deeper sense of meaning in their life.
So when you say that like, is it bad to make that jump that fast, or it's okay?
Generally speaking, those that 2 point jump is not
Yeah,
going to happen after one therapy session,
got
let's
it.
say, or one coaching session,
Got it.
because how I am defining happiness, and maybe this is helpful for us to walk through. I have 5 components of
Yeah,
happiness to look for, but those are they're deeper things. They're not just I bought a car and so I feel happy in the moment. Okay. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. By the way, I encourage clients to have something they look forward to every single day,
yeah,
whether it's just a cappuccino. But if you're having a really crappy day doing things you really don't like at work or something's happening in your life, I encourage people to just write down, even on their calendar, what's one thing I'm looking forward to today?
yeah,
Schedule it in so you have that.
yeah.
Um, but the five different uh, components of happiness that I think are important when we are talking about happiness to level set us. So I think generally people talk about positive emotions. I want to feel good, Bijal. Yes, perfect. That is absolutely one of the 5 components. We want to have those happy emotions. Great. Things like pleasure, warmth, comfort, even like rapture, like
Mm.
those positive type of emotions. And you can be nuanced about it. Like, notice I didn't say just happy,
Yeah.
right? Understanding what do we mean? What are those positive emotions that you're more likely to feel? So that's the
Mhm.
first one. The second one has to do with engagement. This is where we are enjoying what we're doing. Like, I'm really enjoying this conversation that we are having, the back and flow and the chemistry here, the comfort here. So there's a sense of engagement. Uh,
Mhm.
you've probably experienced flow at some point because your podcast is Hustle and Flow.
Mhm.
And but even when you were starting your business, there were probably things about it that you didn't like, but then there were parts of it that you really enjoyed. Like, I
Mhm.
saw you light up talking about all of your clients and the group that was coming in and you getting to meet everybody and have people meet each other. I saw you light up.
Yeah.
That's engagement in what you're doing, and that's really important for people to have. So that's the second component is engagement. It doesn't have to necessarily be flow, although that's fantastic too when you're losing your self-consciousness, you're losing
Yeah.
a sense of time, that flow, but also just enjoying what you're doing in the moment. So that's
Mhm.
number 2. Number 3, it has to do with meaning. Do you feel like your life has some type of meaning? And I don't necessarily mean religious. I've already shared I'm not that
Right.
religious, but some sort of meaning beyond yourself. That might mean just caregiving. That might mean caring about the environment, but caring about something beyond yourself and then having some activities in your life related to that meaning that also boosts your happiness. So
Mhm.
that's number 3. Number 4 is a sense of accomplishment, feeling like, oh, yes, I did it. And it's not just ego based that, yes, I earned that much money, but it's more like having a goal for yourself or feeling like you did something that was worthwhile. Some like, yes, and that leads to a sense of self agency that I am capable. I'm not a victim. So that sense of accomplishment is important. And then the fifth component has to do with positive relationships in your life. So we grew up back in the day, in the caveman days, cavewoman days. We grew up in tribes. We had groups of 100 to 150 around us. And even though our modern society doesn't encourage that level of connection, that deep connection anymore, it is it's still hardwired into our brain. So having some positive relationships in your life is really going to boost your happiness too.
It's so interesting. As you were talking through the 5 things, I could totally recognize where when I was sick and honestly was at a place of depression, I could totally recognize in what you were talking about, right? Like there's the isolation piece. So you're not really letting people in. You're not connecting with as many people. I was on a sabbatical, so I didn't feel like I was achieving hardly anything. And it wasn't just that, it was on the day to day. Like I didn't really feel like I was achieving even small things. Um, and then the meaning. I've actually shared with a few people when I was at my lowest low, I felt like I didn't matter, that my life didn't matter. And I was not suicidal, but I did not feel like I was contributing to society in a meaningful way. And I know those were like the last 3, but those really spoke to me. And I just feel like, I mean, obviously it's science based and you don't need proof that what you're saying is true. Um, but I just echo the sentiment of I don't know the science behind it. That was the first time I heard those 5 things. And it 100% tracks with when I was feeling at my lowest and the things that it took to kind of get out of that, which was finding that meaning again, finding that purpose, re-engaging and connecting with others. Um,
I'm curious, Heather,
yeah.
while you were going through that, were you able to label that or categorize what was going on and why you were feeling depressed? Or was it only in hindsight, looking back at it, that you were able to see that, you didn't feel like you had meaning, accomplishments, etc.?
I think it was both. I think I was able to identify the way that I was feeling, but I could not recognize that it was depression. So when I was in that space, I couldn't, like when we think of mindfulness, right? And there's the meta piece, I couldn't, I could see it with, I'm like, for those of you watching YouTube, you see what I'm doing. If you're listening, you're like, what is she talking about? Right. Like it was, I could see it within the space that I was in, but I didn't have the meta awareness of what that meant.
Yeah. Well, I'm
Yeah.
glad that you had the support with the therapist while you're going through that.
Yes. Yes. And I think, it's interesting in workplaces. We don't necessarily talk about therapists or getting help in that way. And yet, this is completely related to the science piece. It, your performance at work is one thing, but the ability to deal with your emotions and what is happening and making the most of your life, which is a lot of time at work, is so critical. It's so important. And I really do hope that that some of that stigma is going away. Because I don't see how you can be an effective leader and be happy at your job if you're not bringing that in.
I agree. It leads to decreased engagement, decreased happiness, and actually engagement. If people are leading others or on a team, and you notice somebody is not engaging in conversations, in team meetings, in the Slack, or however the communication is happening, that's an indication that they're not happy at work. And
Mhm.
what's the number one reason why people are not happy at work? It's because they feel like they don't have one person at work that really cares for them.
Mm.
So I think it's really interesting that with the turnover that happens at companies, and they want to just throw more money, and that can be helpful in the short term. But the number one reason people leave is that they feel like they don't have a best friend at work. They don't have somebody who really cares for them at work. It's just so interesting.
Well, and money, right, in many ways is the circumstance. So if we're thinking back to the set point on happiness, money can only achieve so much. It can only motivate people so much. And they may stay. That's a common phrase in the legal world is the golden handcuffs. People may stay, but that doesn't mean they're going to be happy. And maybe you don't care if they're happy, but you would think that you would care because it's gonna be a better environment, and you're probably gonna have better profits and everything else when you've got engaged, happy employees.
Completely. Productivity goes through the roof compared to where they are currently when employees start, another psychology term is flourishing. When they start flourishing, when they feel like they belong on teams, when they feel like people really see, hear, and value them. That's just a
Mhm.
fundamental need. It doesn't matter if we're at work or not at work, but when somebody really has that deep sense of belonging and feeling meaning in all of the things that we talked about as far as how I think about happiness, when that is also there at work, it's super powerful what can happen.
Okay, I see that I'm already, like, going over time because I could literally talk about this for hours. This is so fascinating to me. So, I'm sure that the listeners are thinking, number 1, I could use more happiness in my life, and 2, because they are leaders, they're entrepreneurs, they're in companies, um, they could probably provide more happiness for their employees as well. Um, how can they find out about you? And I know you've got a program that they might be interested in, so I'm going to let you share.
Sure, absolutely. I have a special for all of your listeners, and that is a self-paced course that is normally $97, but I'm giving a code for all of your listeners here. If you enter the code FLOW on a link that I'll share in a moment, that cost goes down to zero. So I am definitely on a mission to have people be happier in their lives because we only have a short amount of time on this earth. Like, who knows when it's going to be over? Let's make the most of it. And so there are in this course, it's not like you have to redo your life completely. You don't have to quit your job. You don't have to leave your significant other, change your in-laws, etc. It's little tweaks that we can do in our life that make really huge changes in terms of how we are experiencing our life. So that link, I think you can include that maybe in the show
Yes.
notes. But it's
Yes.
pretty short. It's just bit.ly/learn happiness. So that's bit.ly/learn happiness. And this course has a lot of practical templates. It has some theory too, if you want to geek out on that, like I do. What leads to being derailed from happiness, for example, or other assessments and tests, quizzes that you can take for yourself just to see how you're doing. So anyway, again, that code is flow and the site is bit.ly/learn happiness.
We will absolutely put those links in the show notes. And thank you so much. That is so generous. I know I'm going to take you up on that as well. So everyone definitely go take that course. That is such a generous offer. Bijal, thank you so much for coming on to Hustle and Flow. And I know we're going to stay in touch because I'm not going to let you get away from me because I'm so fascinated by all of your work. So thank you for coming on and sharing with us today.
It was my pleasure, Heather. Good to see you.
Thank you so much for joining me for this week's podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, give the episode a like and leave a comment below so we can keep the conversation going. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a future episode or announcement. Listening on Apple, Spotify, or another podcast app, you can watch the video and join in the after-show conversation by visiting hustleandflowpodcast.com.